The financial and critical success of Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, gave the visionary director a significant amount of momentum and leeway in getting his follow-up off the ground. However, in order to achieve the liftoff he desired, he felt compelled to uproot his family and relocate to England. European filmmakers had been making great strides in creative autonomy during the early 1960s, and Kubrick desired the same level of control and artistic respect for himself. This move would prove to be a boon to Kubrick's career, kicking off an extended period of acclaim and success that saw the production of not only the best work in his filmography, but some of the best films of all time.
Now then, Dmitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb.
Whereas Dr. Strangelove was decidedly earthbound in its concern for nuclear weapons' potential for devastation on a planetary scale, Kubrick's eighth feature film would quite literally shoot for the stars in its scope and ambition. Kubrick's fascination, like millions of others, was gripped by the great space race of the 1960s, a time when mankind achieved the technology to break free of Earth's gravitational pull and venture forth in exploration of the heavens. He engaged in a series of spirited debates with noted science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke over our place in the cosmos, intelligent alien life, and artificial intelligence. Their conversations gave way to serious collaboration, with Clarke offering up several of his novels and short stories as source material for Kubrick to adapt. Kubrick aspired to make, in his words, proverbial good science fiction film, and fashioned his narrative from a combination of Clarke's short stories, arranging them into an examination of mankind's evolution as a process aided by extraterrestrial intelligence. The result was 2001: A Space Odyssey, and its matter-of-fact and realistic, yet no less romantic, depiction of our spacefaring future captivated the imagination of millions.
18 months ago, the first evidence of intelligent life off the Earth was discovered. It was buried 40 feet below the lunar surface, near the crater Tycho.
Kubrick's films have always been noted more for their craft and style than their cast, and 2001 reinforces that notion almost to an extreme, scaling back the characterization to the barest of minimums. Acting as his own producer, Kubrick had no one to object to his decision to drop traditional story structures and render the film instead as an enigmatic audiovisual experience. Dialogue is almost non-existent, with the first spoken line not occurring until we're already 25 minutes in.
Here you are, sir. Main level, please.
What little dialogue there is serves either as exposition, or as a means to move the story along in the simplest of strokes. Anything else is banal and ordinary, emphasizing Kubrick's thesis that space travel would be so commonplace by the year 2001 that any novelties would have worn off. This idea is personified in the character of Dr. Heywood Floyd, played by William Sylvester, who is introduced to us early in the film as a traveling businessman en route to the moon, his lack of wonder at the whole enterprise suggesting he's made this trip several times before. He's more attached to his life back home on Earth, at one point even making a video call to his daughter on her birthday. The daughter is played by Kubrick's own daughter, Vivian.
I've wondered whether you might be having some second thoughts about the mission.
How do you mean?
Kier Dulia plays the Jupiter mission commander Dr. Dave Bowman, who can be considered the film's conventional protagonist. As the man chosen to lead a research mission out to Jupiter after the discovery of the first indisputable evidence of intelligent life outside of our planet, Bowman's personality is downplayed considerably. He is a blank, emotionless slate that tells us absolutely nothing about who he is as a person. The same can be said for Gary Lockwood's slightly more aggressive deputy, Dr. Frank Poole. Ironically, it's the self-aware, artificially intelligent supercomputer HAL 9000 that comes across as the most emotional, relatable character in the film.
Can you hold it a bit closer?
Sure.
That's Dr. Hunter, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Voiced by Douglas Rain and represented only by a red light inside of a large glass lens, HAL 9000 possesses an omniscience that gives way to something resembling neurosis, and its ability to acknowledge its own existence leads to it actively protecting said existence at any cost when threatened. The visual style of 2001 marks a radical shift in Kubrick's aesthetic, not the least notable aspect of which is the director's return to glorious color, after 1960's Spartacus. Shot by cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth in the staggeringly wide 220:1 Super Panavision aspect ratio, 2001 is a film that demands to be seen on the largest screen possible. Kubrick's panoramic vistas are rendered in large swaths of vibrant searing color, or, alternatively, inky blotches of black. He makes excellent use of the color red in particular, using it as a recurring visual motif to distinguish man from the colorless voids of space and technology. Red, as we all know, is the color of blood, the essence of life, so to speak. In the film, it is a color that belongs firmly in the domain of the humans. It's the color of Bowman's spacesuit, for instance, as well as the interior of the reconnaissance pods, the only part of the ship saved from the watchful eyes and ears of HAL 9000. Or so we think. However, as HAL 9000 becomes more human-like in its expression of concern, the balance of Red's ownership tilts decidedly in the computer's favor. It starts off with only the little red light in its eye, but much like the inside of the human body, Kubrick eventually reveals that HAL 9000's interior memory mainframe is literally drenched in red. Kubrick's camera work echoes HAL 9000's supposed infallibility in its compositional position, deliberately set back from its subject so that it may observe the action in a cold, clinical manner devoid of subjectivity. Kubrick's frame makes excellent use of depth, frequently incorporating one-point perspective compositions whose lines all converge towards a singular point in the distance. The pacing is glacial, at times unbearably so, but it also reinforces the endlessly patient, calculating nature of its antagonist. Despite the plodding nature of 2001's storytelling, Kubrick and editor Ray Lovejoy still infuse it with punches of new wave expressionism, like jarring jump cuts that radically disrupt the visual continuity. The most famous example of this is perhaps the most famous jump cut of all time, where Kubrick jumps forward 4 million years within a single frame, by cross-cutting from a bone in the air to a similarly shaped satellite suspended in orbit above the Earth. Nearly 50 years after the film's release, this cut in particular is still breathtaking in its sheer audacity. Kubrick's inventiveness extends to other aspects of the film, such as sound design. 2001 was groundbreaking in its realistic depiction of the sonic aspects of space travel. Most science fiction films tend to value entertainment over realism, and thus blatantly disregard the well-known fact that space is a vacuum, and sound needs air in order to travel and be heard. Recent films like Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity have reintroduced us to the idea of the silent cosmos, but Kubrick's realistic treatment of the phenomena in 2001 blazed the trail in using the lack of sound as an asset. Long stretches of the film are just simply the sounds of the astronauts' breath inside their own helmets, and they are just as tense and exciting, if not more so, than they would be if accompanied by a richer soundtrack. Kubrick was praised throughout his lifetime as not just a gifted storyteller, but also as a pioneer in filmmaking technology. His inherent knowledge of the film medium gave him the confidence to create 2001's striking effects in camera, fully rendered onto the original negative so as to preserve the highest image quality. Despite having a team of visual effects artists at his disposal, it was Kubrick himself who accepted the film's sole Academy Award win for its visual effects. The irony of the only Oscar Kubrick ever won being the result of work he couldn't fully claim as his own surely must not have been lost on him. As an artist who demanded complete control over his projects, Kubrick prized shooting his films in the manageable isolation of studio sets. This also allowed Kubrick to impose his own design aesthetic on the sets themselves. 2001 must have been a very appealing project to Kubrick in that the demands of the story dictated shooting entirely on sound stages. This, combined with the need to create the various miscellanea of a futuristic existence, results in what is perhaps one of the most meticulously designed films ever made. Ernest Archer, Harry Lang, and Anthony Masters share the production designer credit under Kubrick's vision, creating a distinctly 1960s vision of the future. Kubrick and his designers incorporate banks of pure white light into their sets as a recurring motif throughout the film, such as the walls of the briefing room on the moon, the floor of Bowman's Baroque-style apartment suite in the Stargate sequence, and the entire interior of the Earth-orbiting space station. This has the effect of creating a cold, even light that eliminates all shadows and allows Kubrick to objectively examine his subjects like they were exhibits in a museum. The technology on display in 2001 is remarkably prescient. While full-scale space travel is not yet a reality, we do have several things that the movie predicted would be commonplace by the dawn of the 21st century, like portable computer tablets and video calls. Of course, any project into the future is bound to miss a few marks. Kubrick rather accurately predicted that space travel in the 21st century would give way to private corporations and commerce, rather than remaining strictly governmental or military endeavors. While this is now in the infancy of becoming a reality thanks to Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic and SpaceX, Kubrick erroneously, yet logically, predicts that major airlines would have made the natural expansion into space. For instance, Dr. Floyd is seen flying to the moon in a Pan Am-branded spacecraft. Since Pan Am wouldn't last as an operating company long enough to even see the year 2001, it's easy to look back on Kubrick's inclusion and laugh. However, that would be losing sight of 2001's design as a valid historical document, an expression of our dreams and hopes for the future during the early romantic era of spaceflight. Given that we have been firmly grounded here on Earth ever since, that aspect becomes more poignant than ever. Kubrick's reputation as a fuser of indelible image and inspired music really begins in earnest with 2001. Whereas his previous films might have augmented an original score with adaptations of existing classical material, here Kubrick eschews a composer and a conventional score entirely. Inspired perhaps by the graceful pirouetting motions of the space station, Kubrick yet again made film history by pairing the sequence to the dizzying waltz of Johann Strauss's Blue Danube. Similarly, Kubrick uses Richard Strauss's bombastic classical piece, Also sprach Zarathustra, throughout the film, to symbolize the wonder of mankind's evolution. We hear it when the apes realize that bones make great tools, and we hear it again when Bowman re-enters our dimension and is reborn as a star child. Much like Blue Danube, this piece is ingrained into our collective social psyche and inextricably paired with visions of space and the cosmos. In addition to using classical music from romantic eras, Kubrick turns to compositions from modern maestros like Giorgi Ligeti, the man behind a fundamentally unnerving suite of cubes that accompanies the terrifying appearances of the Black Obelisk. Primal and dissonant, the piece features a building chorus of men's voices seemingly scrambling over each other in a bid to escape some unseen evil emanating from the bowels of the earth. It's the kind of music cue that makes one's skin crawl, so of course, Kubrick uses it as his beginning musical overture, filling the screen with an impenetrable blackness for several minutes before the story begins in earnest. Just as radically as Kubrick deviates from the straightforward visual style of his previous films in 2001, so too does he loyally adhere to the same set of themes that have fascinated him as an artist. He uses the film's storyline about evolution as a conduit into further explorations of violence, essentially stating that it is a natural byproduct of the evolutionary process. If evolution can be described as survival of the fittest, then it stands to reason that those who can assert dominance over the ecosystem will prosper, and the only way to assert said dominance is by force. The apes' discovery of tools allows them to take charge of their own development, but it's only a short matter of time until they pervert the tool's original purpose for warfare. Mankind built its civilizations on the foundations of violence and war, and as such, it is a fundamental component of our humanity. 2001 filters its ideas about personhood and evolution through the lens of technology, another major theme in Kubrick's body of work. The character of HAL 9000 represents the countless ethical conundrums surrounding the concept of artificial intelligence, but most importantly raises the question, at what point does an artificial intelligence achieve personhood?
I hope the two of you are not concerned about this.
No, I'm not, Al.
Are you quite sure?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question, though.
Of course.
How would you account for this discrepancy between you and the Twin 9000?
Well, I don't think there is any question about it. It can only be attributable to human error.
The ship's human inhabitants view HAL 9000 as another crewmate, and they entrust their lives to its stewardship. We know the computer is as intelligent as humans, if not more so, because Kubrick shows it winning a game of chess against Dr. Bowman. As intelligent as it may be, HAL 9000 is still not a human, and cannot emote, yet it shows increasing signs of paranoia and neurosis as trouble mounts during the mission. It stands to reason that a self-aware entity would fight to defend its own existence, which the story of 2001 makes more than clear when HAL 9000 pleads with Bowman before being shut down.
Will you stop, Dave? Stop, Dave.
Throughout history, man has fashioned technology in service to its needs, but it's the tipping point in which technology itself emerges as a dominant species that captivates Kubrick's interest.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Just as we now bear little resemblance to the apes from which we descended, one could argue that the next link in the chain of evolution will appear quite dissimilar to humankind. 2001 raises many questions, but it is here that its core line of questioning becomes clear. Will humanity's successor come in the form of cold machines, or does our destiny instead lie out in the vast expanse of the cosmos? 2001 also makes potent use of several of Kubrick's signature storytelling conceits as a way to imprint his stamp, despite the radical tonal departure from his previous work. While Kubrick formally dispenses with the omniscient voiceover narration that peppered his previous films, he essentially achieves the same purpose here with the incorporation of the all-knowing, all-seeing HAL 9000 computer. This is also the film in which Kubrick perfects his use of one-point perspective compositions, hypnotically luring us deeper into his world by traveling down the length of claustrophobic tunnels. An extreme version of this is evident in the infamous Stargate sequence, in which Bowman travels to another dimension entirely. Additionally, the rendering of Bowman's enigmatic apartment suite in the gilded style of Baroque decor points to Kubrick's fascination with the era, and serves as a link to a common thread that runs through his filmography in its disparate genres and styles. 2001 is no doubt a massively influential work, but it didn't achieve that status overnight. The film debuted in 1968 to severely mixed critical reception. Kubrick's intentionally obtuse storytelling frustrated countless old-school critics, but more enlightened critics immediately recognized the film's brilliance and importance. The film also had something of a slow start at the box office, until it caught on as a cult hit among young adults, who would come to late-night screenings, stoned out of their gourds no less, to lose themselves in the psychedelic Stargate sequence. The idea of the film as a cinematic milestone began catching on in earnest when the next generation of filmmakers, the generation that brought us Star Wars, credited 2001 as a key inspiration in their work. Over time, the film's legacy has only grown stronger, and its induction into the National Film Registry in 1991 ensured its preservation for generations to come. Perhaps his best known and most widely viewed film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, rocketed Kubrick to the top of his field, cementing him as one of the most influential filmmakers of all time. Though Kubrick would not live to see the year 2001 himself, his groundbreaking work here assured that his legacy would carry on well into the 21st century and beyond.
Do you know what kind of a camera that is? What it's called?
It's a home movie.
Arrowflex, it's called. Napoleon is still in his grave,
Pending.
waiting to be brought back to life. I wonder what Napoleon would think of Lou Wasserman and David Picker.
Same.
Whether he would like to have them passing judgment on his life.
After the success of 2001, Kubrick started working earnestly on a long gestating passion project, Napoleon, an epic biopic that would have starred Jack Nicholson as the infamous French emperor. Kubrick had spent most of the 60s conducting an exhausting amount of research for the project, and by the time he was finished he had an elaborate note card system that detailed Napoleon's exact movements, one note card for every single waking day of his life. However, right as cameras were preparing to roll in 1969, the project fell apart, and the subsequent year's failure of a similarly themed Napoleon film named Waterloo killed any chance Kubrick might have had in reviving the project. Even today, Kubrick's unrealized Napoleon project still haunts the film community as one of the greatest films never made. Kubrick was now faced with the task of finding a new project to develop in the wake of Napoleon's failure, and he turned to a book that Terry Southern had recommended to him on the set of Dr. Strangelove, a book Kubrick had initially dismissed as incomprehensible. That book was Anthony Burgess's seminal novel, A Clockwork Orange. Looking at it with new eyes, he was drawn to the book's dystopian setting and its examination into the psyche of a violent young man as a byproduct of his environment. As he had done with 2001, Kubrick served as his own producer as well as his own screenwriter in adapting A Clockwork Orange to the screen. The film is a curiosity within Kubrick's body of work in that it is very faithful to its source novel, whereas Kubrick had a reputation for dramatically altering source material to fit whatever given movie he wanted to make. This can be credited to the fact that Kubrick disregarded his own script and worked on set using the novel itself, an uncharacteristically haphazard approach for the notoriously disciplined director, but it fit with the lo-fi improvisational nature of the shoot.
The Durango 95 purred away real horror show. A nice, warm, vibraty feeling all through your gutty woods. Soon it was trees and dark, my brothers, with real country darkest. What we were after now was the old surprise visit. That was a real kick, and good for laughs and lashings of the old ultra-violent.
Clockwork Orange is at its core a character study, which places a significant burden on the shoulders of its young star, Malcolm McDowell. Under Kubrick's steady hand, McDowell turns in a career-defining performance as Alex, the twisted, psychopathic antihero at the center of the story. While his crimes are vile and reprehensible, it's a testament to both Kubrick's vision and McDowell's boyish charms that we as an audience ultimately find him sympathetic, and, dare I say it, relatable.
It was my rabbit to help the prison Charlie with the Sunday service. He was a bolshy, great, burly bastard, but he was very fond of myself, me being very young, and also now very interested in the big book. I didn't so much like the latter part of the book, which is more like all preachy talking than fighting in the old in-out. I like the parts where these old Yehudis tolchok each other and then drink their Hebrew vino, and getting onto the bed with their wives' handmaidens. That kept me going.
McDowell's devious characterization of Alex results in one of the most influential and iconic film characters of all time, a status that still stands today judging by the cues Heath Ledger took from McDowell for his portrayal of the Joker in The Dark Knight. McDowell isn't the only actor in the film, but his performance towers over every other cast member to the point that one would be forgiven for thinking otherwise. That's not to say that the other cast members don't pull their weight and help fill out Kubrick's nightmarish, dystopian version of the future. Patrick McGee and future Darth Vader David Prowse are notable standouts. Working with cinematographer John Alcott, Kubrick trades the polish and gloss of 2001's visuals for a decidedly lo-fi indie aesthetic. Tonally, the visuals of A Clockwork Orange play like a hybrid between Kubrick's clinical, restrained classical style and a hyperactive Saturday morning cartoon. For instance, Kubrick and Alcott exposed most of the 35mm film image using only natural light, resulting in a lifelike, down-to-earth look that features pops of color amid drab, neutral backgrounds. However, in those same shots, he also uses wide-angle lenses to distort and exaggerate reality to unrealistic proportions. This is also reflected in the camera work, which alternates between static wide shots that observe the action dispassionately and up-close, handheld shots that bring the objective point of view firmly into the subjective. A Clockwork Orange's reliance on natural light seems peculiar, if not entirely out of character, for Kubrick, whose reputation for controlling every aspect of his image was infamous. However, this development can be ascribed to two defining aspects of Kubrick's artistic aesthetic. Kubrick was well aware of his superlative talents, and saw each project as the definitive film in his particular genre. So when he saw the wave of scrappy, low-budget youth films streaming out of Europe and America during the late 1960s, films like Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, he decided that he would adopt the same affectations in an effort to deliver A Clockwork Orange as the ultimate youth picture, much like he had done for the sci-fi genre in 2001. Additionally, Kubrick's interest in natural light didn't stem from light itself, but rather in the technological advancement of lenses that required less and less of it to properly expose the film negative. This speaks to the pioneering aspect of Kubrick's craft, his constant push to eliminate technical limitations on the realization of a filmmaker's vision. This approach is mirrored in the edit, where Kubrick and editor Bill Butler brazenly cut from distant observational setups to dynamic handheld shots that bring the action up close and personal. Kubrick uses the expressionistic nature of his edit to creatively portray the film's most violent aspects, such as the murderous bludgeoning of the cat lady. Instead of showing us the act itself, Kubrick cuts away to a series of rapid shots of the cat lady's paintings, strung together in such a fashion as to suggest animation. A Clockwork Orange's editing was highly influential, forecasting the rise of rapid music video-style editing popularized by films of the 90s and the aughts, as well as the stylistic flourishes of filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Oliver Stone. The world of A Clockwork Orange affords Kubrick several opportunities to further develop his aesthetic.
So far, the first film was a very good professional piece of cine, like it was done in Hollywood. The sounds were real horror show.
The frequent usage of narrative voiceover, one-point perspective compositions, and extended tracking shots, sometimes even the combination of the two, such as the shot of Alex roaming his beloved record store, are the clearest visual indicators of Kubrick's hand. He also experiments with a few new techniques, like the breaking of the fourth wall, or filming from the floor up at someone leaning over a closed door. A very unconventional, somewhat disconcerting angle he would turn into a trademark. Like his previous 3 films, Kubrick shot A Clockwork Orange in England, both in London and around his home in Elstree. He recruited John Barry as his production designer, who adapted existing locales to fit the needs of the story, rather than build entirely new sets. To convey the dystopian feel of Kubrick's vision of a future Britain, Barry sought out socialist-style housing projects in municipal buildings built in the brutalist school of architecture. The cold, uninviting concrete structures stand like oppressive symbols of a society that has allowed youths like Alex to run amok, a society that's lost any interest in civic infrastructure or social betterment. Kubrick contrasts this with the interiors of Alex's family flat, a garish mishmash of bright colors and patterns that suggests a counterculture struggling for its voice in the absence of a unifying message. The production design of A Clockwork Orange suggests a very different future than the one Kubrick depicted in 2001. Indeed, this future is decidedly earthbound and considerably more cynical. Wendy Carlos, credited here as Walter before her sex change operation, fashions the score for A Clockwork Orange as a blend between Baroque classical compositions and computer-age instrumentation. Alex's love for classical music is reflected in the appropriation of works like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, filtered through the inspired use of a Moog synthesizer and vocoder that makes it sound as if it were being sung by a computer.
Singing in the rain, just singing in the rain.
This perversion of music's inherent beauty extends to the inclusion of Singing in the Rain, which runs over the end credits in addition to being sung by Alex as he brutally rapes a woman during a home invasion.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again.
Kubrick's filmography is littered with music that plays counter to the actual image it accompanies, but A Clockwork Orange is really where he perfects his surprising, brilliant concoctions. Our perception of Singing in the Rain has been permanently discolored, seared into our collective memory as the sound of impending doom. Kubrick peppers the soundscape of A Clockwork Orange with a sort of audiovisual irony, giving a twisted elegance to the carnage on display. Kubrick's career-long meditation on sex and violence takes center stage in A Clockwork Orange, what with its depiction of a seemingly lawless future society and explorations of conditioned behavior. The character of Alex is the result of a hypersexual culture, a culture that is implied through the pervasiveness of penis popsicles and pornographic pop art displayed in the homes of otherwise respectable, upstanding citizens. Perhaps as a prediction of the nascent birth control movement, Kubrick's vision of a future Britain is a world in which sex has been stripped of consequence, and thus exists merely for titillation and self-serving gratification. In other words, it is simply for entertainment. Whereas bored teenagers of the 1970s would find entertainment in hanging around drive-in movie theaters and cruising the main strips of their hometowns, the bored teenagers of A Clockwork Orange get their kicks in the form of indiscriminate rape and torture. Rape is a particularly salient theme for Kubrick to explore, precisely because it is the intersection of sex and violence. It perverts the act of love into an act of hate, and Kubrick's somewhat humorous yet ultimately horrifying depiction of it forces us to reckon with the darkest parts of our own humanity. Man's capability for inhumanity towards his fellow man and woman is reinforced by Kubrick's exploration of the inhumanity capable of institutions, civilization's invention to protect man against himself. The brutalist architecture of the socialist housing blocks, cold, concrete structures with no personality or history reflective of their inhabitants, reinforces the purely utilitarian reasons for the existence of institutions. In their efforts to create a stable civilization and strip man of his wild nature, they overreach and subsequently take away a man's ability to govern his own behavior.
I've learned my lesson, sir. I see now what I've never seen before. I'm cured. Praise God.
The sacrifice on behalf of the individual for the greater good of the societal whole is a common theme that runs through Kubrick's work. Films like Paths of Glory, 2001, and Dr. Strangelove all examine the inhumanity of institutions towards the individual. A Clockwork Orange still stands today as Kubrick's most controversial film by any standard of measure. The violence and carnage on display was shocking, and far exceeded anything that had been made up to that point. In the wake of its release, public furor over its content and real-world copycat crimes prompted death threats on Kubrick and his family, leading to his voluntary withdrawal of the film from UK cinemas, an embargo that would last until his death in 1999. In America, the film was a runaway hit, and secured a nomination for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. With the divisive success of A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick's reputation as a daring maverick auteur was assured. If he wasn't already the figurehead of the new wave of radical filmmaking sweeping the world, he was now.
Kubrick largely made his career out of confounding expectations. Each work in his filmography belongs firmly within its genre, yet at the same time also acts as a blatant subversion of said genre. Paths of Glory turned the romantic war epic into an ethics debate. Dr. Strangelove twisted the conventions of the sex comedy by giving it cataclysmic, end-of-the-world stakes. 2001 traded the cheesy pulp tropes of mid-century science fiction for a sweeping sense of ominous wonder towards creation and the unknown. After the highly controversial, ultraviolet A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick again surprised the film community by swinging another 180 degrees in his choice for a follow-up. A stuffy costume drama based on an obscure 1844 picaresque novel written by William Makepeace Thackeray, entitled The Luck of Barry Lyndon. Knowing what we do of Kubrick's career up to this point, however, the selection of Thackeray's novel isn't surprising at all. Kubrick had spent years exhaustively researching the life and times of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte for an epic film that fell apart shortly before cameras could roll, forcing him to channel his energies instead into A Clockwork Orange. A film adaptation of The Luck of Barry Lyndon afforded Kubrick the opportunity to repurpose the mountains of research he had amassed for Napoleon, given the similar time era and cultures depicted in both works. Working from his own script, and with his brother-in-law Jan Harlan as an executive producer, Kubrick set about making Barry Lyndon, an oversized production that took 2 years to film and endured no less than 2 shutdowns as its budget swelled to $11 million. Despite Kubrick's great difficulty in getting the film made, Barry Lyndon's mixing of old-school costume dramaturgy and the filmmaking techniques of the new wave to convey the misadventures of a charismatic charlatan results in one of the best films of the 1970s, and arguably the finest film of its illustrious director's career.
How do you do? I'm Captain Feeney.
Captain Feeney?
Captain Feeney at your service.
The Captain Feeney?
None other. May I introduce you to my son, Seamus?
How do you do? How do you do?
And now I'm afraid we must get on to the more regrettable stage of our brief acquaintance. Turn around. And keep your hands high above your head, please.
During this time, actor Ryan O'Neal was at the peak of his career, and his performance as the titular Barry Lyndon remains perhaps the very tip of that peak. As Lyndon rises from rags to riches, only to fall back to rags once more, O'Neal applies a composed nuance to each stage of the journey. Lyndon's decades-long growth from stubborn, idealistic lad to disdainful, hedonistic adult is given a convincing sense of the passage of time by O'Neal, who excels at projecting a world-weary countenance onto his boyish face. For Lady Lyndon, Kubrick looked to model Maurice Berenson, who wasn't required to do much besides standing around in a silent, statuesque fashion. However, Berenson imbues the character with a layer of fundamental sadness, masked by stoic composure that serves the story well as it draws to a close. When she signs off on an alimony check for her disgraced lout of a husband, she pauses and looks up for only the briefest of moments, but in that moment she lives a lifetime. Supporting performers of note include Leon Vitali as Lord Bullingdon, who would later go on to become Kubrick's personal assistant and casting director on his final 2 films, as well as 2 veteran Kubrick performers on their second tour of duty, Patrick McGee and Philip Stone. McGee, who played the crippled political dissident in A Clockwork Orange, appears in Barry Lyndon under an eye patch and a pound of white makeup as the aristocratic libertine Chevalier de Balabarry. Stone, who likewise appeared in A Clockwork Orange as Malcolm McDowell's father, plays Graham, a meek banker for Lady Lyndon and an unexpected conspirator against Barry. Barry Lyndon is widely regarded as one of the most beautiful films ever made, and for good reason. Working once again with cinematographer John Alcott, Kubrick puts his prior experiments with natural light to masterful use in rendering the pre-electric world of Barry Lyndon. Kubrick's visual presentation differs radically from his previous works, in that he presents scenes as carefully staged tableaus, expertly composed to provide staggering degrees of depth, resembling the paintings of 18th century artists like Thomas Gainsborough. The romantic feel of Kubrick's compositions are further emphasized by the use of soft focus, which diffuses the frame's highlights and adds to the film's sense of Baroque glamour. Kubrick's subjects and locales, impeccably designed with a careful eye to authentic period detail by Dr. Strangelove's production designer Ken Adam, are lit almost entirely with existing natural light, an aesthetic choice that really accentuates the red and blue pops of color from British and Prussian military uniforms against the golden earth tones of pastoral England. Kubrick was so intent on creating an authentic pre-industrial world that, in the process, he managed to pioneer an entirely new technology that would change filmmaking forever. Working with NASA, Kubrick developed a specialized lens that could capture a beautiful exposure using only a few candles. Many nocturnal scenes in Barry Lyndon are lit entirely by candlelight, and the organic feeling of these scenes would be highly influential in the continued development of low-light technology, while its groundbreaking use in Barry Lyndon would become one of the cornerstones of the film's legacy. Kubrick's supreme confidence in his mastery of visual language is on full, flagrant display in Barry Lyndon. The fact that he presents his scenes almost entirely in masters while rarely cutting away to other coverage speaks to the sheer audaciousness of Kubrick's vision and technical prowess. The effect is staggering and stately, a reflection of the pompous rigidity of his subjects. In the hands of a lesser filmmaker, this approach would be endlessly boring. But Kubrick incorporates the unconventional filmmaking techniques of New Hollywood, techniques he himself helped to popularize, in order to breathe immediacy and energy into the proceedings. While there are a few characteristic tracking shots, as well as several instances of handheld documentary-style photography, Barry Lyndon mostly plays out in the aforementioned master tableaus, aided by the frequent use of zoom lenses to zero in on a particular detail within the scene, or vice versa. Kubrick uses this conceit repeatedly, creating a hypnotic mood that pulls us deeper and deeper into his Baroque vision.
In the blue.
At this point in his career, Kubrick had fully embraced the use of classical music over an original score, and to this end he enlisted Leonard Rosenman to create new arrangements of famous works by Bach, Vivaldi, Mozart, and Schubert, in addition to several Irish folk songs.
The object of Barry's attention, and the cause of all his early troubles, was his cousin, Nora Brady by name.
Papa,
Yes, Brian.
will you buy me a horse?
Will I buy you a horse?
Barry Lyndon's most memorable piece of music, Handel's Sarabande, was reappropriated as a theme song of sorts, thundering along as Barry's fate unfolds.
I am the resurrection of the life that saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead.
While on the surface, the musical character of Kubrick's classical selection seemed quite appropriate to the images they accompany, he nonetheless uses it subversively. The operatic Sarabande march in particular suggests the trials and tribulations of a great king, someone like, say, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Well then, there's nothing else for it.
However, Kubrick bestows this theme not on a king or emperor, but on a peasant who lived large for a while and ultimately died as a penniless nobody. The sense of history and importance that Sarabandi conveys runs counter to Barry Lyndon's actual life, reflecting only his supreme narcissism. Despite its regal, stuffy aesthetic, Barry Lyndon contains all the visual hallmarks of its subversive maverick director.
As he rode away, Barry felt once more that he was in his proper sphere, and determined never again to fall from the rank of a gentleman.
The combination of one-point perspective compositions and an omniscient narrator places the audience at an observant remove from the action. The story's examination of royal aristocracy in its heyday allows for the indulgence of Kubrick's fascinations with Baroque architecture, as well as the ineffectual pageantry and customs of the time. Lyndon's stint in the military also provides an opportunity for Kubrick to further explore violence in the circumstance of warfare, specifically the strangely self-sacrificial rituals of battle in the pre-industrial era. In those days, antiquated notions of honor and valor were attached to leaving oneself open and exposed to enemy fire, as if taking cover to protect oneself was an act of cowardice. This can be seen in the gorgeously colored and decorated, yet highly visible uniforms worn by soldiers, which certainly made them appear as magnificent gentlemen, but had the unfortunate side effect of advertising their location to their enemies from a great distance. The style of combat reflected this as well, with armies advancing on each other while politely taking turns in their exchange of fire, effectively leaving the entire front line vulnerable and willingly exposed to a volley of musket balls. Under Kubrick's hand, these notions of civilized warfare among gentlemen become highly curious and ironic. This idea is echoed on a smaller scale in the sequences where Barry participates in turn-based duels. In the world of Barry Lyndon, violence has been institutionalized by the civilized as a means to resolve disputes or inflict disciplinary punishment. But in the process, it's lost the emotion and intimacy that makes it meaningful. Instead of violence being a reflection of our inhumanity to our fellow man, it is violence itself that has become inhuman. Kubrick's body of work is held in such high regard today that it's easy to forget the release of his films were regularly met with something of a mixed bag in terms of reception. They were, understandably, ahead of their time, and many people didn't quite know what to make of them. Many outright hated them, but nonetheless they knew that they also had to respect them. This can certainly be said of Barry Lyndon, whose release was met with modest box office success and mixed critical reception. A 3-hour-plus non-epic about the 18th century European aristocracy may not have been everyone's cup of tea, but damned if they didn't respect it. And respect it they did, all the way to the Oscars, where the film took home golden statues for Alcott cinematography, Adams's production design, Rosenman's score, and even the costumes, while Kubrick himself was nominated for Best Picture, Director, and Screenplay. Kubrick's achievement here is nothing less than masterful, and while he would never get to make his long-gestating Napoleon film, he was able to channel that passion into making Barry Lyndon a stone-cold masterpiece, one that very well could have stood head and shoulders above Napoleon had he made it. In a filmography composed almost entirely of masterpieces, Barry Lyndon stands out as quite possibly the finest of the bunch. Stanley Kubrick was unique among filmmakers in that he didn't specialize in any one particular genre. Rather, he liked to sample from all of them, like one would a craft beer flight, and deliver a final product that would serve as the gold standard within its respective genre. By the late 1970s, the horror genre was phenomenally popular, a reflection of turbulent, uncertain times, and a fundamental distrust of authority. Kubrick sensed his irrelevance within the horror genre, and sought to rectify the situation while bringing artistic legitimacy to otherwise schlocky fare. This meant finding subject matter that was completely different from the usual assortment of zombies, ghosts, and vampires. After pouring through mountains of prospective material as per his custom, he found what he was looking for in The Shining, Stephen King's seminal novel about a man driven mad by the spooks residing in an old Colorado hotel. Kubrick was infamous for radically changing his films as source material, and his treatment of King's The Shining is perhaps the most egregious example of that. King's initial screenplay draft was thrown out by Kubrick, who disagreed with the author's supernatural-heavy take, and instead hired Diane Johnson to help him rework the story into a tale about malevolent energy and its effect on the human psyche. Working once again with his brother-in-law Jan Harlan as executive producer, Kubrick set about making his version of The Shining in England, a production that would bog down cast and crew for over a year while the director battled his way through the shoot's frequent and frustrating speed bumps. The final film initially met with lukewarm critical reception and a scathing dismissal from King himself. But Kubrick's hypnotic take on the horror genre would grow in esteem and infamy until it became considered as one of the master filmmaker's finest films, and, quite possibly, the scariest film of all time.
Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me, and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract, in which I have accepted that responsibility? Do you have the slightest idea what a moral and ethical principle is, do you? Has it ever occurred to you what would happen to my future if I were to fail to live up to my responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
Well, I'm very confused.
The Shining isn't the first time that actor Jack Nicholson crossed Kubrick's orbit. The director previously had Nicholson in mind to play the titular role of Napoleon in his failed Passion Project. Instead, Nicholson makes his Kubrick debut here as Jack Torrance, the frustrated protagonist turned antagonist.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
An actor well known for his brilliantly unhinged performances, Nicholson turns in perhaps the best work of his career by channeling a fundamental twitchiness, as if he's uncomfortable in his own body. His spiraling psychosis is at once both riveting and terrifying to witness.
I'm not gonna hurt you. You didn't let me finish my sentence. I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains in.
You did this to him, didn't you?
Shelley Duvall is also effective as the ineffectual, meek, and needy wife to Nicholson, a woman whose mundane blandness is almost oppressively so. Duvall famously had a rough time on the production, where Kubrick tormented her with constant verbal abuse.
No, I can't.
Yeah, but when you came out like this, you said, just
we're sitting there because they say, wait a minute,
okay.
and then you say on the radio,
but when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time there.
I can't even get
Well,
this
bring it
door
down.
open.
If it was all done to get a certain performance out of Duvall, it certainly worked. Duvall's exhausted shakiness projects a hopeless demeanor that adds to the film's overall tension. As the young, innocent Danny Torrance, Danny Lloyd doesn't fall prey to overacting, the bane of all child actors. And it is precisely this restraint which makes his red rum trance so bone-chilling and memorable.
Stop it! Red rum! Red rum! Red rum!
For supporting cast, Kubrick reunites with a couple familiar faces, Philip Stone and Joe Turkel. In his third consecutive appearance for Kubrick, Stone assumes the persona of Delbert Grady, the ghostly waiter of the Gold Room, whose distant politeness and manner is uncomfortably creepy.
My girls, sir, they didn't care for the Overlook at first. One of them actually stole a pack of matches and tried to burn it down. But I corrected them, sir.
Turkel, who last worked with Kubrick on 1957's Paths of Glory, plays Lloyd, the Gold Room's bartender. Turkel is particularly inspired casting, as his gaunt visage already resembles that of a skull. Turkel adopts an emotionless, painted-on smile that sears itself into our retinas, like a morbid Cheshire cat. Scatman Crothers, who used his friendship with Nicholson to get into the casting room, plays the Overlook's head chef, Dick Halloran. Crothers' role is an important one, as he shares Danny's ability to shine, and explains the phenomenon to the young boy, and by extension, explains the title to the audience.
I can remember when I was a little boy, my grandmother and I could hold conversations entirely without ever opening our mouths. She called it shining.
The Shining marks Kubrick's third consecutive collaboration with director of photography John Alcott, and their groundbreaking work together on Barry Lyndon translates here into a horror movie that looks unlike any other. Beginning with the sweeping, rock-steady helicopter shot that opens the film with the majesty of the Rocky Mountains, Kubrick and Alcott immediately signal to us that this won't just be another cobwebs and candelabras creepshow. The Shining, perhaps more so than any other Kubrick film, features the near-constant use of one-point perspective compositions, which imbues the 35mm film frame with an evocative sense of depth. By setting up the Overlook Hotel as a three-dimensional space, Kubrick and Alcott then introduced the idea of exploring every nook and cranny via their camera. While The Shining features lots of conventional dolly camera work, its legacy lies in its introduction of Garrett Brown's Steadicam rig to audiences. Kubrick was fascinated by the organic yet serenely smooth nature of Brown's groundbreaking camera innovation, and he uses the technique here almost as if it were its own character. Indeed, many of the shots in The Shining give us a distinct sense that a foreboding, unseen entity, or even the hotel itself, is alive and watching the Torrance's every move. Instead of relying on the gothic imagery of horror films past, Kubrick employs the Steadicam to generate the film's unnerving creepiness. His expertise with various lenses also helped him considerably as far as this new tech was concerned. By placing an extremely wide lens on the Steadicam, he could create an exaggerated sense of momentum, speed, and gravity, which served to better place the audience in the point of view of malevolent, ethereal entities. Also returning to the Kubrick fold is musician Wendy Carlos, who teams up with Rachel Elkin to deliver the Shining score. This being a Kubrick film, their work isn't necessarily comprised of new original cues. Rather, Carlos and Elkin appropriate and manipulate dark existing works from contemporary classical artists, weaving them into a foreboding tapestry that underlies and enhances Kubrick's images. Most of the film's music is filtered through the prism of a Moog synthesizer, previously used to equally chilling effect in A Clockwork Orange. The electronic synths are worked into an ominous music bed, peppered with disembodied chanting voices and the rhythm of a throbbing heartbeat. Perhaps the most recognizable aspect of The Shining's musical soundscape, however, is the use of the Ray Noble Orchestra's vintage recording of a slow love ballad called Midnight, the Stars, and You. Used in the background of the scene where Jack may or may not be hallucinating a 1920s-era ball, it gives us a peek into the glamour of the Overlook's heyday while underscoring the tragedies that doomed it to ruin. Kubrick was a master of ironic song choices that served as counterpoints to the images they accompany, and his juxtaposition here of a glamorous old-fashioned love ballad, echoing in the foreboding emptiness of the Overlook, creates an irony that is distinctly chilling. A significant reason of why The Shining has endured over the decades within a genre that seeks to top itself with every new entry is Kubrick's inclusion of heavily coded visuals and cues. The Overlook Hotel is presented as a giant puzzle that requires multiple viewings to solve, a reflection of Kubrick's own love for the intellectual stimulation provided by chess. A documentary film released in 2013, Room 237, examines the various interpretations and hidden messages inherent in The Shining. These conspiracy theories, for lack of a better term, range from the reasonably sound, like the film being a metaphor for the genocide of the Native Americans, to the utterly ridiculous, like the film being Kubrick's confession that he faked the moon landing for NASA. The documentary itself is well worth watching to see all the various interpretations of meaning that The Shining has given birth to since its release, but two interpretations in particular bear legitimate explorations. Ever since Nicholson uttered the line,
"White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden."
Academics and fans alike have drawn allusions from Kubrick's film to the massacre of the Native Americans. The Overlook is stuffed with Native American imagery, from decorative quilts to the cans of Calumet baking powder that line the stockroom. This interpretation was first popularized in 1987 by former ABC reporter Bill Blakemore in an essay entitled Kubrick's Shining Secret, where he points to the closing image of Nicholson's face among the revelers in a photograph of the Overlook's 1921 July 4th ball. He writes, "Most Americans overlook the fact that July 4th was no ball, nor any kind of Independence Day for Native Americans. That the weak American villain of the film is the re-embodiment of the American men who massacred the Indians in earlier years. That Kubrick is examining and reflecting on a problem that cuts through the decades and centuries." The second interpretation that suggests The Shining as a massive puzzle is the inconsistent and conflicting layout and geography of the Overlook itself. King famously modeled the novel's version on the infamous Stanley Hotel in Colorado, a purported hive of paranormal activity and spectral spooks. Like he did with King's story, Kubrick rejected King's suggestion to shoot at the Stanley in favor of his own design, basing it on the Timberline Lodge situated at the peak of Oregon's Mount Hood. Kubrick shows us the Timberline in wide shot during bright daylight towards the beginning of the film, allowing us an unadulterated, extended glimpse of it. This isn't merely an establishing shot, however, it's the setup of an extremely subtle deception on Kubrick's part. For the rest of the exterior scenes, Kubrick built a condensed-scale version of the Timberline's facade outside a soundstage in England. The effect is a hotel exterior that looks the same upon first glance, but under closer scrutiny reveals dramatic inconsistencies. This approach extends to the interiors, all built on a soundstage in such a way that allows Kubrick to run a Steadicam through its grand halls, residential corridors, and industrial kitchen spaces seamlessly. What we don't realize as an audience, however, is that if one were to map the layout of Kubrick's Overlook on a sheet of paper, and many have done so, one would find an impossible geography pockmarked by dead-end corridors, windows where there should be walls, and other curiosities. Kubrick's Overlook is like one of those haunted house mazes where the door disappears behind you the moment you enter the room. Architectural design aesthetics vary wildly from room to room, creating a mishmash of jarring colors and styles from drastically different time periods. By rendering the Overlook in such a way, Kubrick is subtly suggesting that the hotel itself is a living, breathing entity of evil that exists outside of normal space-time. The Shining, more so than any other film in his filmography, illustrates one aspect of Kubrick's work that becomes clear only in retrospect, a recurring motif that incorporates imagery from the Greek myth of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. Mazes, labyrinths, and tunnels play a huge role in shaping Kubrick's aesthetic worldview. Ever since he sent a camera careening down a narrow New York City street in Killer's Kiss, Kubrick has made potent use of the tunnel as a visual allegory. There's also another allusion to the Greek myth in Killer's Kiss in the form of the opening credit that reads A Minotaur Production, the name of Kubrick's production company at the time. This could hardly be construed as coincidental, especially when such similar tunnel imagery appears in Paths of Glory's Embattled Trenches, or 2001's claustrophobic spaceship corridors. Kubrick's protagonists always seem to be descending into an underworld of sorts, where they will have to confront a supernatural enemy. The Shining is easily Kubrick's most overt reference to the Greek myth, what with the long, languid takes that roam the Overlook's countless nooks and crannies. He even places the climax inside a literal maze, just in case we were incapable of picking up on his earlier signals.
Little pigs, let me come in. Not by the hair on your chinny chin chin. Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
The horror genre serves Kubrick well in his explorations of sex and violence, allowing him to indulge in more lurid meditations of each. See Jack's psychotic axe murder spree, or the ghostly naked woman in room 237. Or even this fundamentally unnerving shot. The Shining is no doubt a film about a man's swift downward spiral into madness, but Kubrick's particular ideas about the fragility of the human psyche make for an utterly original film that bears his unmistakable stamp. He never quite tells us what exactly is causing the hotel's unexplainable phenomena. Are these ghosts simply a manifestation of Jack's growing psychosis, or are they authentically supernatural? Michael Chement, a leading Kubrick scholar, has pointed out in his writings that whenever Jack converses with the ghosts of the Overlook, he is always situated so that he is talking into a mirror. This would seem to definitely suggest that Lloyd the bartender and Grady the waiter are simply manifestations of Jack's psychological state. But then later on in the film, Grady is depicted physically releasing Jack from the meat locker that Wendy's trapped him inside.
You give your word on that deal, Mr. Torrance?
I give you my word.
When this happens, we're forced to admit that the real source of the Overlook's evil is ultimately unknowable. This is where the true horror of The Shining lies. The Shining is held in such high regard today that it's easy to forget that Kubrick's first and only horror film was not well received when it was initially released. Critical reviews were unfavorable, and box office receipts were lackluster before the film picked up steam quite some time afterwards. In setting out to conquer the horror genre, Kubrick created an enduring classic that continues not only to chill us to the bone, but to awe us with its impeccable craftsmanship. Very few horror films can be rightfully called masterpieces, but The Shining is just that, a stunning, reference-grade work of cinema that dares to show us that true horror comes from within.